Welcome to this predicted paper from Psychology Ninjas. This paper represents the best guess for the upcoming exams. Please use this paper in addition to your other revision. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account. Which of the following best describes environmental determinism in psychology? 1 mark. The command word here is which, or to write which one best describes. You can just write the letter in your exam booklet, or you can tick it if it's a multiple choice question like this one is. We have some assumed psychological knowledge here in terms of environmental determinism. So not only what determinism is, but which one is environmental determinism. So we're looking for the correct definition for this term. We've got a number of different options here. Firstly, that an individual is in charge of their own actions, that all events have a cause that can be manipulated to observe a causal effect, the view that all behaviour can be predicted, that all behaviour is caused by previous experience. Individuals being in charge of their own actions is free will rather than determinism, so that's the opposite side of this debate. So when we're talking about determinism, we're suggesting that all behaviour has a cause and effect relationship, and that by determining the causes, we can then predict effects. When we're talking about environmental determinism, we're thinking about previous experiences determining that cause and effect relationship. So we need to select the last one, that all behaviour is caused by previous experience. Which of the following terms refers to traits that are passed down from parents to their offspring? 1 mark. Here we have the command word which, often followed by the command word write. So you're writing the term down or the letter into your exam booklet, which is lined paper for this exam. So we have our definition here and we're looking for the correct term. So we've got behaviourism, which is our term for learning theories and a specific approach. Nurture, which is all about environmental factors affecting behaviour. Hereditary, which is that we've passed down genes from one person to another, so we've inherited traits. Or interactionism, which is about the combination of nature and nurture factors. So we've got a definition about passing down genes, and the term for that is hereditary, and we would select that for our answer. Explain alpha bias and suggest one limitation of alpha bias in the understanding of human behaviour. 4 marks. We have 2 different command words here. Firstly, we've got explain and then suggest. So we want to think of this question as 2 plus 2. 2 marks for explaining and 2 marks for suggesting. So with the command word explain, we need to give a detailed definition of our particular term. Here we want to explain the term alpha bias in order to show off our psychological knowledge. Alpha bias exaggerates the difference between men and women and often devalues one gender in relation to the other. Here we've looked at alpha bias in relation to gender, and we've been really clear that it exaggerates the difference between men and women. That's for our first mark, and then we've extended that definition a little bit, saying the consequence of it, that one gender is devalued in relation to the other. We're then going to the second part of our question to suggest a limitation of alpha bias. Now, when we're suggesting this, we need one limitation. There's no point in putting more than one down. And within that, we want to identify that limitation and then suggest or justify it or explain why that is a limitation. Let's have a look at this limitation part of our question. Psychological research that has alpha bias in terms of gender continues the discrimination of women and sexist ideas. Darwin's view in evolutionary psychology that women are choosy ignores that women are as competitive and aggressive as men when certain situations arise. So we've identified a limitation in that it perpetuates discrimination and sexist ideas. We've then explained why that is a problem in relation to specific research from evolutionary psychology. Now you could use a different piece of research here to justify the same point, and that would be absolutely fine. Suggest one way in which psychological research might be considered socially sensitive. 2 marks. Here we have the command word suggest, which is asking for a briefer explanation of a particular concept or limitation. In this particular case, we're looking at a way in which psychological research is socially sensitive. Now, it's really important when we think about socially sensitive that this is about the research once it's been published, rather than the construction of the research and the design of the research. For the 2 marks available, we want to identify something about socially sensitive research and then apply that to a particular piece of research or a particular study. Let's have a look at a response. Sieber and Stanley suggests that the phrasing of the research question can be used to target specific groups within society, making them a target for prejudice and discrimination after the research has been published. Biological psychology has historically given rise to suggestions that there are gender or racial differences in intelligence that have led to the discrimination of groups and segregated education. We've identified a particular way in which research might be socially sensitive in terms of the research question. We've also explained why that then makes it socially sensitive, because it might target specific groups. We've gone to apply this to a particular area of psychology in terms of biological psychology, and we've given a specific instance in relation to this in terms of intelligence tests. So quite a lot here for our 2 marks. Discuss idiographic and nomothetic approaches to studying human behaviour, 16 marks. Here we have the command word discuss, which is asking us to explain or outline and then evaluate. So our outline is 6 marks, and this is our knowledge of our 2 particular approaches, idiographic and nomothetic, different ways in which we might study behaviour. The remaining 10 marks in this question are about the strengths and weaknesses of using those different approaches. And because there's more marks for evaluation, our essay should have more evaluation than explanations of these 2 different approaches. Let's start by explaining or outlining an idiographic approach. Psychologists that take an idiographic approach to studying human behaviour focus on in-depth studies of individuals or small groups that have had unique experiences. As such, idiographic research is often conducted on a small scale in order to gather detail about participants' experiences and understand the meanings, beliefs and values around a behaviour. We've given a really detailed outline of idiographic approach here, showing our understanding of this way of studying behaviour. We've focused on it being in-depth, and we've identified that not only individuals are using idiographic approaches, but also small groups with the same experience. We've identified that this is on a small scale to gather rich, detailed information. We're then going to move into evaluation. By alternating our skills, we're hitting both assessment objectives in order to boost up our levels if we run out of time. By using idiographic methods, psychologists are able to gain new insights into the nature of human behaviour, particularly in socially sensitive areas of research, where developing a rapport with an individual is necessary. We've identified or linked this into our unique experiences of people using this approach so that we get new insights. And we've identified that this might be particularly important with socially sensitive areas of research. Now, we could give some examples here in terms of maybe either forensic psychology or relationships or maybe aggression that would boost this response at this point. We've gone in further here and said that it's important to develop a rapport. And by that, what we mean is a relationship or a connection with the people that we are investigating. We're going to explain this further, showing off our psychological knowledge by identifying particular pieces of research that have used this approach. Cognitive psychologists have used brain damage patients to explore the nature of memory in depth. Shallis and Warrington's exploration of KF's abilities with memory helped to determine that there are subcomponents within short-term memory. KF was able to complete visual but not verbal tasks within short-term memory, suggesting that short-term memory is not a unitary store. Now, it's important to note that cognitive psychologists mainly use nomothetic approaches. However, they have on instances used these idiographic approaches and case studies, particularly when exploring brain damage patients. We've given a specific example in terms of KF, and we've shown our knowledge by giving specific findings from this piece of research and what it told us about short-term memory. We're then going to develop a counter-argument of why idiographic approaches might not be so useful. However, idiographic approaches are subjective and their reliance on qualitative data analysis is less valid, as the researcher's bias may impact how the data is classified. Replications of case studies are not possible due to the nature of an individual's brain injury or traumatic experience that would be unethical to reproduce. The variations in brain injuries may be a confounding variable in explaining an individual's behaviour. It's important here we identify not just that they use qualitative data, but why that is a problem. So it's less valid, it's less accurate, and more open to researcher bias. We've also given further detail about why replications might be problematic and that this might result in confounding variables. So these would be uncontrolled extraneous variables that might manipulate or change the results of our particular piece of research. We're going to complete this paragraph by giving a mini judgment about idiographic methods. Therefore, without the use of idiographic methods, psychologists would not have identified variables to test and would have an incomplete understanding of human behaviour. Holt suggests that taking an idiographic approach ends up with general laws, and so a combination of approaches should be used. We've generally been positive about the use of idiographic approaches, but we've also suggested that actually these two approaches combine in order to give a complete explanation. Firstly, by using idiographic approaches to identify the variables that then can be tested on a larger scale. We're going to return back to the idiographic approach, explaining in more detail how this is used to research particular behaviours. Psychologists taking an idiographic approach are not looking to make generalisations, and so focus on qualitative methods of data collection that highlight the importance of validity to represent those individual participants included in the research accurately. We've identified that actually idiographic approaches aren't looking to make generalisations, hence the use of particular data collection techniques. We've highlighted that case studies, in-depth interviews and therapy conversations are all going to generate that qualitative data, and also the two approaches that most likely to take this approach to data collection. We're going to return back to evaluation once again. Using an idiographic approach is time consuming, as the large amounts of data gathered from interviews need to be transcribed and analysed in detail. This time we've started with a weakness, the time-consuming nature of analysing this data and the vast amounts of data that have been gathered using these methods. We're then going to explain this in more detail, again going back to specific examples that we know from our understanding. Freud's exploration of little Hans's phobia of horses using psychosexual development and its use as evidence of the Oedipus complex demonstrates the use of idiographic methods, but lack control over variables necessary to conclude cause and effect. We've taken an example from psychodynamic approach, but you could use other examples here as long as you're explaining the impact of them on evidence. And for here, we've talked about little Hans being connected to or explaining the Oedipus complex. We've also continued that problem by saying we have a lack of control over variables and we cannot conclude cause and effect. We're going to give a counter-argument once again, returning back to strengths of an idiographic approach. However, humanistic psychology recognises the need to address the power imbalance between the researcher and the researched, rather than emphasising the measurement of human behaviour. By studying the whole person and understanding experiences from their perspective in order to understand the role of the self within the development of human behaviour. Our positive this time comes from humanistic psychology and this idea about a power imbalance between our researcher and research, particularly using non-idiographic methods. We've linked this into a particular understanding from humanistic psychology. You could go for different parts of this in terms of congruence or unconditional positive regard would be absolutely fine. And we're going to give another judgment once again. Given the investment of resources in idiographic methods, the conclusions gathered may no longer be relevant to contemporary society. So because these are often longitudinal, gathering in-depth data, by the time we come to our conclusions, actually society may have moved on and this behaviour might not be so important, or these ideas may no longer be relevant. We know this is particularly true with Freud and psychosexual development, and the sexualisation of children now sits quite uncomfortably within contemporary society. It's now time to move on and start to look at nomothetic approaches. So let's go back to our outline, this time focusing on this part of our question. Nomothetic approaches to psychological investigation seek to establish general laws and are focused on the ability to generalise findings by forming representative samples of participants to test. As such, using nomothetic approaches requires a large number of people to be studied so that conclusions can be drawn. When discussing nomothetic approaches, we need to focus on this idea of establishing general laws. All the other decisions comes from this idea that we want to be able to explain lots of different people and establish that kind of cause and effect relationship. This means that we need large samples, and we're going to use approaches or use research methods that enable us to get large samples of data from lots of different people. Once again, we're going to go back to evaluation, again ensuring that we've addressed both skills within our question and command word. Positive psychology focuses on evidence-based practice to give credibility to the conclusions drawn about human behaviour by developing standardised procedures that can be replicated. Again, all of this goes back to the idea of general laws, that if we're wanting to have lots of different participants, we need a standardised procedure that then gives us credibility because we're using similar methods to scientific approaches. We're then going to explain this with a specific example. Skinner's laws of conditioning have been replicated with a range of animal and human participants. Skinner designed a special cage in order to examine the role of operant conditioning, called a Skinner box. The rat naturally explored the cage. When it accidentally pushed the lever, a food pellet was released. The rat would continue to push the lever when hungry to get more food, and if pushing the lever did not release the food, then the rat stopped pushing the lever. Skinner conducted replications to test the role of reinforcers with other animals and found that the behaviour continued if it was rewarded. When pigeons pecked a disc that produced a food reward, they continued to peck at the disc, showing that behaviours could be learnt. We've used Skinner's research here from learning theories and behaviourism. However, you could use lots of other different examples. We've gone into quite a lot of detail here because we're looking at replications. So we've talked about both about rats and pigeons in order to illustrate our point. We've also gone into detail about the procedure in order to identify this standardised procedure as part of our explanation. We're going to go into a bit more detail here, elaborating with further examples. Furthermore, Watson and Rayner demonstrated that a similar process of conditioning could be implemented in humans. Their use of a laboratory for the observation of little Albert provides high levels of control, ensuring the internal reliability, so that the conditioned stimuli of the white fluffy objects and the unconditioned stimuli of the loud noise could be consistently paired together, enabling cause and effect to be determined. We've given identifiable research here in terms of Watson and Rayner's study. We've talked about the impact of using a laboratory experiment or a laboratory to conduct their observation in terms of internal reliability, that within the study it was consistent. We've explained the impact of this in terms of establishing cause and effect relationships. We're going to give a final judgment about the usefulness of using nomothetic approaches. As such, external reliability can be ensured for theories where studies with different participants have similar findings to establish general laws of behaviour. We've given a clear conclusion surrounding external reliability this time, talking about replications with different participants having similar findings. We're going to return once again explaining nomothetic approaches. Nomothetic approaches focus on quantitative data collection through the use of structured questionnaires and experiments. Psychologists are able to compare the data collected from large samples by collecting numerical data that can be easily analysed to form generalisable conclusions. Replicating scientific methods of investigation using human participants has been the focus of behaviourists and the biological approach in order to be objective in their examination of behaviour. We've identified specific research methods within the nomothetic approach, talking about questionnaires and experiments. We've also linked this to particular areas or approaches within psychology. We've clearly explained why these decisions have been made. We're going to move back into evaluation once again. In developing causal relationships, the nomothetic approach is useful for predicting and controlling behaviour, giving psychology scientific status. So we've identified that using similar research methods gives psychology and science a similar background, increasing the likelihood that the conclusions would be accepted. We're then going to show off our psychological knowledge by giving a detailed example. Biological psychologists take a nomothetic approach when explaining obsessive-compulsive disorder. OCD, and claim that OCD is caused by higher levels of dopamine and lower levels of serotonin. Drug therapies are developed on the basis of nomothetic research and work by readdressing a biological imbalance. SSRIs are used to treat OCD and increase the availability and uptake of serotonin, thus reducing the anxiety associated with OCD, which helps to improve the lives of people suffering from this condition as a result of nomothetic research. We've identified that levels of neurotransmitters has been a key conclusion from nomothetic research, and we've talked about the impact of that on society with the development of drug therapies. We're then going to give a counter-argument or a weakness of nomothetic approaches. However, nomothetic approaches only provides a superficial understanding of human behaviour. For example, Milgram's research found that 65% of participants obeyed an authority figure and inflicted a 450-volt electric shock because they were ordered to do so. The results fail to provide an explanation of why each person obeyed, or very different circumstances that have also led to obedience found in each participant. So we've identified a counter-argument in terms of a superficial understanding. We've given our example using Milgram from social psychology, but we could talk about other pieces of research that lack validity. We're saying although it gives an explanation, it doesn't explain why each person obeys or why different circumstances might result in the same behaviour. And we're going to come to a judgment once again about nomothetic approaches. Therefore, despite a superficial understanding of human behaviour, nomothetic approaches are more useful in developing psychological treatments to help society. We've focused on the usefulness of approaches and their applications to give our conclusion. We're going to make some final concluding remarks to give an overview of these different approaches to identifying and explaining human behaviour. Idiographic methods are time-consuming, which limits the implementation of this method in psychology. Replication, enabled by the use of standardised procedures, enable nomothetic methods to test a wide range of participants. Subjectivity significantly impacts the data collected and conclusions drawn by idiographic methods. Generalisations from the data collected enable psychologists to develop effective treatment programmes. You can complete a unique version of this paper by going to our Psychology Ninjas site. Psychology Ninjas is full of free content to help you with your exams. You can save your scores with a free account.